Okay. So Davida is with us, but in the office finishing up something. So we will give her a moment to do so, and then we will jump into today's Mishnah, which you can find at the top of page 239 in our Siddur.
239 Siddur. Okay. 239. Thank you. I appreciate that. 239. 239. Okay. I'm going to be moving around, so I'm going to get my picture off of here, but I'm here. I'm listening.
Not too many of us.
We're on 239.
Well, yeah, but that's okay.
I'm glad I came.
We go with the peoples that be here, not the peoples that don't be here.
Oh, I see a lot of people. Okay.
And up there we got a whole menagerie. Okay, so we're at the top of page 339. So 2 weeks ago we did a Mishnah by Rabban Gamliel in which he focuses a lot on trying to encourage people to align their will with the will of God. And that the more one did so, Rhoda is bowled over by this assertion. Oh, now she's back. Okay. But it really created a sense that one had to be sort of
Am I still upside down?
No, you're good now.
Beautiful.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
And we reflected on how does that mean, and does that automatically translate into some sort of coercion of the divine will? And clearly, I don't think our sages bought into that model, but that sense that one should recognize the correctness of Torah as a guide was, I think, their intent. Right? This morning's or this afternoon's Mishnah, in some editions of the Mishnah, is actually part of the previous one and is seen as sort of a companion to it, if you will. And I highlight that only so that you'll sort of say, oh, this sounds like he could be responding to Rabban Gamliel. Okay. So as always, we're just going to read through the Mishnah, and then we'll break it up a little bit. Hillel liked to say, do not separate yourself from the community. Do not trust in yourself until the day of your death. Do not judge your colleague until you come into his or her place. Never speak a word that you could not bear to be heard by others, for in the end it will surely be heard. And do not say, when I have leisure, I will study, lest you never have leisure. Oh. Right? There's a lot going on in that one. And it's intriguing because one of the things that we've noted about Pirkei Avot is they like triads. And here we've got a quintet.
Yeah, one's totally different.
And they're not all the same, I'll put on my modern scholarship hat and say, modern rabbinic scholars might say, well, what we see here is some sort of editing of the text because it breaks the triad format, and the language and the tenor doesn't quite mesh for all of them. Right? But since I'm not really all that interested in recovering or attempting to recover the original, we'll deal with it as it is. All right. So the first thing that Hillel says is, do not separate yourself from the community. And we're left with the question of, why is he even making this statement? What's going, sometimes one has to understand the reality of the world in which Hillel is living, or sometimes it's a little bit about the world in which the redactor, the person who put this in the Mishnah, was living, in order to say what's irritating him, what's bothering him that is triggering that response.
Are people becoming secular?
Secular is a much more contemporary phenomenon, but if I was going to read it and say, how does this speak to me today, I might actually plug in the rise of secularism in Jewish communal life.
You could take every one of those things and not even look at it through the Jewish community. I mean, those 5 things apply to everyone, no matter where they are, no matter what the setting.
Yeah.
That is true. I guess I come with a little bias,
Of course.
but you're right. The realities of communal experience are the realities of communal experience, regardless of what your communal grouping is like. And yes, I know I certainly look at it through the prism of how it impacts and how modernity impacts on the Jewish community. But the reality is, this is a problem for every community that, especially if they're living outside their native land. You remember?
The dysphoria?
Well, I don't know that he's talking about diaspora per se, but for us, there's a lot of that. Do you remember the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
Yes.
It was a great movie.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, loved it. Okay, if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's very amusing. The sequels, like many sequels, are nah. But the first one is classic. And what's the storyline? The storyline is this: a woman who is raised in a very insular Greek family, steps out of that world and brings home the poster child for, the non-Greek world, right? And it's all about how they reconcile with that reality and how they sort of draw him into the community in a way that they can absorb him to some degree, or at least feel comfortable with him as part of their community. I'm oversimplifying the movie a little bit, but it's all about the otherness, and he's trying to understand them, and they're trying to make sense of him. To this day, Jody and I use a line from the movie where the aunt is trying to wrap her brain around the fact that he's a vegetarian. So you don't eat meat, right? Okay, I'll make lamb. and Jody and I will say that to each other when we have some things that just we'll make lamb, and it just makes But it's this classic example of culture clash, not in a bad way, but it's a reality. So Hillel is living in the 1st century of the Common Era, right? Which means that you're dealing with Roman rule. The Hellenistic Greco-Roman world is like a tidal wave. It just washes over all of the known world and influences it in all sorts of ways, both ones that are perceivable and ones that are not. The rabbis recognized that there were influences on the Jewish world. And there's a teaching by Rabbi Meir that says you should treat, I'm paraphrasing, you should sort of treat the Hellenistic world like a pomegranate. Pomegranates have lots of seeds, and the seeds are wonderful, but to get to them, you got to go through all the pith and skin and peel it all away. And, pomegranates are kind of a pain to use if they are whole, and they are it's easy when you get a little container of the seeds that are in a but he's going like, it's there. We're living in it, right? And there's good stuff in it. You know, he's not a complete rejectionist and saying, oh, it's other, it's foreign, it's bad. It's like, no, there are desirable elements. You just got to be able to sift through all the pith to find the pearls. Right? And the rabbis did, and in fact, embrace certain things that have become so normative that they're lost in some ways on the original culture from which they emerged, but have become a permanent staple of our Jewish calendar. So not that many weeks ago, we celebrated Pesach.
Client.
Well, not only we reclined, that whole structure of the Seder that's a Greco-Roman banquet and a symposium that goes with it. All right, this is one, all right. To the best of my knowledge, symposia are not part of contemporary Greek society. They don't do it. I don't know what other things they may do, but they don't do that in that format, right? We have preserved something that's 2,000 years old, but it's, you know, a lot of the, and we fill it, it's like a cream-filled donut. We've pushed in all the cream, the Jewish cream that we want, and the frame is the frame. It's okay. And the rabbis had no problem with that. And nowadays, I remember when I first started talking about, it's really just a this. There were some people who were just like mortified. What do you mean it's Greek? Because our image of Greeks is sort of created by Hanukkah, and they're the enemy. So wasn't emulating the Hellenists in the age of the Maccabees a problem? Yeah, it was, but Rabbi Meir is sort of like the linchpin there. It's like, it's not all bad. You just got to know what's good and what's bad. And that's true for any cultural encounter that we have. And so we're routinely and regularly adopting stuff. So part of what he's concerned about, I think, is come back to Hillel in the first century, right? So you do have people who are Hellenizing and are going, you know what, being part of a minority is a little not so cool sometimes. I'm just going to go be a nice Hellenized person and done, right? Or he's looking at it as there's a lot of divisions within the Jewish community, including some extremist groups. You've got groups like the Essenes who are advocating, we're just going to go live in the Judean hills, in the Qumran caves, and we're going to pretend nobody else exists. And he's going like, no, no, no. Yes, you're part of a community, but you're part of a community that has distanced and removed itself from society, and that's bad. Right? And then you had other groups that were violent and pushing for rebellion against the Romans, and the rabbis were not big fans of that. It's like there's a mainstream community, and that's the one you kind of need to be part of. And it too has a wide array of expressions, but at a certain point, the rubber band stops, and leaving everything to go off into the wilderness and ignore the world, too far. Extreme violence, too far. There are too fars. And you're going like, don't go too far.
So he's also dealing with the rise of Christianity.
Actually, he's not. Yes, he is living in the era of the crucifixion, but I remind you that it's only around Rabbi Yehuda, who's the editor of the Mishnah, is the one who's dealing with Christianity.
So it wasn't just a big threat yet.
It was not, because at the time, who were Jesus's followers at the time of his crucifixion?
Jews,
Jews. All right.
And-
Who were his followers a generation later?
Jews.
And the generation after that? Still Jews. All right. And you had within the group, you had Judeo-Christians or Jews who believed in Jesus. Right? But they were very much, they perceived themselves as part of the Jewish community, and they went to shul and they observed mitzvot and they did all the things that other Jews did. They just thought of Jesus as not a messianic figure, but as a teacher, as a guide. It's only when Saul comes along and he says, no, 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 no. And you have this radical bifurcation that starts to develop between the Jewish and community and the Jewish community who believe in Jesus.
So it's going to take 3 generations.
It's going to take more than that because Hillel lives like in the first half of the 1st century, right? Paul comes along at the end of the 2nd century, so that's 150 years. That's like 6 generations.
But he was there. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, he was there, but for him, it was not the event that it came to be seen, right? And the final bifurcation doesn't really happen until around 316, 320 something. Someone who's got a better memory for history will jump in, but it's the Council of Nicaea wherein the divinity of Jesus is determined. Before the council, he was just a guy. And after the council, he is the Son of God incarnate. Well, that changes everything. I mean, really changes everything.
So it's going to be 300 more years.
So Council of Nicaea is like so it's another 120 years roughly after the Mishnah, right? Which is it's almost 300 years after the events that are being debated. Remarkably, no eyewitnesses left anymore.
But when eyewitnesses, right, when you go to all his little crew there, they didn't live at the same time, but they were his disciples.
We are all disciples of Hillel on one level. You study people's teachings, am I a disciple of Heschel? On one level, yes, because I've internalized a lot of his teaching. So on one level, yes, but he died in 1972, right? I think, in fact, he died before I ever read one of his books, right? So it's a little fuzzy. The challenge, and I would never say this in most Christian settings, the challenge of the Gospels is that you've got Matthew, which is written 60 years after the events that it describes. And then you have Mark and Luke and John, the latest of which is written almost 90 years after the events they describe, which means that they are describing historical events and they're laying them out in their Gospels, you should pardon the expression, as gospel truth of historical events of which they have no personal knowledge. Right? They are accepting the accounts and they are reading and telling the accounts based on how they understand it, and there's no assertion of I am God's child in a sense greater than you're God's child and you're God's child and he's God's child and I'm God's child. It was not a I'm unique. It was this is who we are. So it's kind of fascinating to read how the Gospels grappled with the historicity of events, right? Right. So for Hillel, Christianity is not a bugaboo, but for Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who's living at the time of Paul, now it's an issue. All right. And all you Jews who were good, pious Jews, but followed some of the teachings of Jesus, which are in many ways not so radical from a Jewish perspective. They're really not. Okay, go. You start following Paul and trash the mitzvot and ignore what the Torah says. Okay, that's leaving the community. Right? So Rabbi Yehuda, in putting it here, may in fact be telling us something similar, but very different from the concern of Hillel, who made the original statement.
That's why you have to know the context of
That's
the
why
time.
that's why context sometimes means a lot. And the reality is that because you said it, you started with secularism, and then the reality is this is today.
Mhm.
This is the big problem of Jewish communal life today, is that people are finding other things that are pulling them away from traditional Jewish communities.
But it's a beautiful statement because it stands for any community you belong to at any time.
Yes, as we noted, it's a very universal issue, and it's a very universal concern. And that's what makes it a classic. Okay. I'm trying to think of what else we can say about. Okay, so the Talmud doesn't specifically address Hillel's statement, but it does talk about participating in the community even during challenging times. And part of the reason the Gemara gives is that if you isolate yourself from the community during a difficult time, you're also going to miss out on the eventual comfort and joy that comes to the community. When things get better, you've put yourself out here and you won't enjoy the same benefits. So the Gemara is kind of making it don't cut off your nose because you might want it later. Whereas our teacher, Rabbi Yonah Gerondi, writing in the 13th century, intriguingly talks about community engagement is important, but choosing the right communal people to partner with. He's concerned about avoiding groups that can be harmful or unethical in their activities. In some ways, he's kind of circling back to Hillel's original thing about they're part of the Jewish community, but they may be out a little too far out of the pale. It's intriguing that remember thinking a little bit about this Mishnah 10 years ago. I'm going to say 10. It was probably a little bit longer ago, but within the organized Jewish community, there's I don't call it a governing body, but there's a collaborative body called the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. And the idea is that it brings together the presidents of all major Jewish organizations for them to sort of talk about what are the issues facing the Jewish community and how do we not trip over each other and bump up against each other when we're trying to deal with stuff. And are there things that we can do together that will serve the community more effectively? And there was a huge debate as to whether to include J Street and its president as part of the organization. J Street was very critical of Israel.
What is J Street?
It was a Jewish organization made very much skewing towards younger cohorts of the Jewish community who were struggling with some of what was going on in Israel, and especially with the government of Israel at the time. It was somewhat, it was very critical of the Israeli government and its policies with regard to the West Bank and Gaza. Gee, doesn't that sound very now? But there was a whole debate as to whether they should be given a seat at the table as part of the spectrum of the Jewish community, or whether they were outside the pale. And in what I would argue was a really dumb decision,
They put him outside?
they kept them outside. Remember, they weren't initially inside. The question is whether they were going to put another seat at the table. And I think they would have done everybody a much greater service by putting them at the table, because at the table, they would have been able to perhaps get a greater nuanced understanding of why the broad panoply of the Jewish community was thought the way it did. And there's nothing wrong with having someone around the table that puts on the table an idea or an argument that you disagree with, because yes, mate, it's not like their vote was going to suddenly change anything.
But it gave you a different aspect and more learning and
And
knowledge.
it emphasized that there was room at the Jewish table for yet another opinion, because they never claimed to be anti-Zionist. You know, it's like, I wouldn't argue in favor of giving a Jewish Voice for Peace a seat at the table, because they want Israel to cease to exist. J Street was not that. It was, we're just really not happy with the current reality. Could only imagine what they would say about the current reality. But it was this idea that how do you draw the boundaries? And that was a I think in my mind, missed opportunity. I think it would have been good for the organization. I think it would have been good for J Street to feel part of, as opposed to excluded from, because I think it just made him a little more radical and a little less connected, which, after all, that is what we want for Jewish organizations as a governing body for American Jewry, is to make young Jews feel less connected. Oh wait, no, that's not what we want. No, I think they shot themselves in the foot. Not that they asked my opinion, though I did offer it to a few people at the time, but
I would have seconded your opinion.
yes, well, unfortunately, you were not a president of a major Jewish organization at the time. Okay, so it really kind of is easy to see how many of these are applicable both universally, both in terms of time. So for Hillel in the 1st century, for Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in the early 3rd century, for us in the 21st century, there's a lot there, and that's always been true. And then, any last thoughts on this before we go to the next stick? Okay.
But I think that particular paragraph is good to take it as a standalone conversation with just about any group.
Yes, absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
published and
Yeah.
Absolutely. I can only imagine, you know, a rabbi, a priest, and an imam all comment on this, and we would sound like echoes of each other, because we're all struggling with it, you know, and
It's a common problem.
right. And I when I was in New Jersey, I had a very nice relationship with the local imam. Um, uh, our little corner of the universe there was really kind of remarkable in terms of the sense of connection amongst clergy and communities and stuff like that. And I never had the heart to say to him, your community is first and second generation. It's not going to look like this by the fourth generation.
No. But that would have been a terrible thing to say to him.
But it would have been, but
It would have been truthful.
it would have been true. It's like, or maybe it would have been, let me tell you the reality of what's happened as generation after generation of Jews have lived in this essentially Christian / secular society. And maybe you can find a different path because you're still early enough on in the process. But, you know, I just remember, you know, as we talked at clergy meetings, you know, the first little things that the kids are in the public high school. And all of the challenges that being in a public high school means for religious minorities. You know, I remember at one point we counted, and there were 20 Jews in the high school of 2,000 plus. Not so easy to wear your kippah when you are that small of a minority. And even within the 20 Jews, you might be the only one wearing a kippah. That requires a lot of personal strength, right? Well, replace kippah with hijab, and it's the same problem. It's the same problem. You know, yeah, the population was a little bit bigger, but not huge, or at least not yet huge. But imagine you are the only girl in your high school class after class after class, where you're wearing a hijab. And that's hard. And then, you know, you come home and say, parents, I love you. I don't want to change, but I don't know that I want to stand out in school like that. So there's a lot of universality to this thing. Right? All right, and then I think that's part of what leads to Hillel's next part, which Ba'al ta'amein ba'atzmecha, do not trust in yourself until the day of your death, which I think is a warning against complacency and arrogance.
Yeah. Because you never know what you're going to do or how you're going to change, or what you can say. This is how I'd react, but you don't know that. And what you were when you were 20 is not what you are when you're 80.
So the conversation that we've been having, I might have just misunderstood. I was looking at that whole paragraph and everything in it.
Mm-hmm.
But were we really just talking about withdrawing from the community?
Well, I think they're all kind of interconnected. Yeah, no, they are absolutely interconnected. And it's you know, for, you know, to say, hey, look at me, I am a stalwart of the community. And then all of a sudden you do something and you're not. You know.
Yeah, because when you said, are we ready to move on to the next?
Oh, you got the
I
next.
was ready to, yeah.
No.
It's fine. I just, it caught me off guard. It was just
just the next, you know, we spent a lot of time focused on the broader concept, but he's got a lot of other pieces to it that I want to break down. Look, I I served briefly a congregation in Rockland County, New York. I say briefly because I was there kind of as an interim, because the shul was at war with itself. I mean, literally, they would vote on something like one board meeting, and then the next month, the constellation of the board was slightly different, and they would undo whatever the previous board had done. Right? But what was the issue that was the catalyst for all of this? My predecessor had engaged in an adulterous relationship with his old high school sweetheart, and he financed it using monies from his discretionary fund.
Oy.
Oi is right. I mean, so many layers of oi. Okay, but here's what what happened. Right? So shockingly, it became known. Of course, it became known. All right.
That's the paper, did it?
Oh, I'm sure it made the paper.
Ours made the paper.
They always make the paper. But I'm using this one only because I know it firsthand, right? And literally half the shul wanted him tarred and feathered and run out of town on a rail. And the other half were going, well, that's his personal life. He's always been, a good representative for the community. He was great when my fill in the blank died. He was wonderful at my kid's bar mitzvah. So that's his personal life. But, as a rabbi, we're fine with him. And the other half are going like, how can you be fine with a rabbi who behaves that way? And they're going like, that's his personal life. It doesn't matter as long as he does what he needs for me. Right? So you can see where reconciling the two groups was not going to be easy. I will. So this is the war that's raging, and whatever the topic was, if Group A wanted it, then Group B was opposed to it. It didn't matter what it was, because there was this meta issue that they could not bring themselves to reconcile with each other. And so I will fast forward and say that I don't think it was a decade, but I'll say a decade later, the shul was gone. Many of their members had gone to other congregations because they could not get past this essential disagreement, But before this became known, I have no doubt, because my predecessor had been there for a big chunk of time, and I'm sure the congregation was going like, okay, he'll be here till he retires, because he's great, he's wonderful, he's da, da, da. And then this happened, and it splintered his family, it splintered the community, so. And I don't know that if you would have spoken to him 5 years before, he would have said, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. If you would have asked him, he said, oh, I would never do something like that. Right? But clearly, but don't be so sure of yourself, right? You never know what constellation of things may lead you down a path that you would never envision yourself going, which, by the way, is the trigger for the next statement that Hillel makes. Right? Do not judge your colleague or do not judge another person until you come into his or her place. It's like, you don't know what was going on that led to that. And I am not going to defend that kind of behavior ever, but if there was enough problem within the family and relationship, then there are ways that you solve it. That's not it. Right? But I don't know what he was thinking. And by the way, I would like to say that was a unique story, but it ain't. there have been too many of my colleagues who have behaved in similar sorts of ways.
But he stole too.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of stuff. There was a lot of stuff. Look, I will tell you that I was not present for it, so I shared this one because I lived in that community for a year. But the community I was in before being here, had exactly the same thing. Well, except no adultery, just pilfering from the discretionary fund. And it's like the other difference was that everybody agreed, no. But it created a level of suspicion, and so it's one of those where stuff happens. So don't feel overconfident. Maybe when you're 80, you can feel a little more confident than when you're 20, because
No,
I'm going to give you that, age and experience may carry you a little bit farther, because, but Hillel doesn't make that emendation. That was me making that emendation, right? So don't be overly prideful or complacent, nor be overly judgmental, because you've never stood in that other person's place, and you don't know what their reality is. So those two kind of those are, if I wanted to do a structural thing, I say, well, really, A and B B and C are really one. So now instead of having 5 statements, I've only got 4 statements, and let me see if I can pair up a couple of others. So I've only got 3 to maintain my purity of structure. But those two really are a tandem about how you look at yourself and how you look at others. Okay, and then the next one, never speak a word that you could not bear to be heard by others, for in the end it will surely be heard.
we have a totally different. It says, do not say it is not possible to understand this, for ultimately it will be understood.
Yeah, the way they're very different, so on the one hand, it's about clarity, and who's the audience. On one level, these Mishnayot in some ways were targeted towards the teachers, the rabbis of that era. And so it's, be clear in what you say. Do not leave room for misinterpretation or misunderstanding, because they will inevitably happen, and that could have disastrous results. The other is, just be mindful of what you say, because what you think you say in private may in fact become public. So
How does the Hebrew translate?
you could go either way. Do not say a thing that is, well, here's the problem. It says she'i efshar lo lishama, that either you think will not be heard or will be potentially misunderstood. Okay? So how you translate that phrase gives you either your translation or my translation. And understand that this is a conservative Siddur. This is a version of Pirkei Avot produced by the same people who produced Lev Shalem. It's the Lev Shalem version of Pirkei Avot. It's the same editorial group, all right? Just that the author translator here is different from the author translator there, and they went with one, and this one went with the other. I guess in part because that one was considered more universal in its audience. This one for a more study-oriented audience, but it's, you know, if I'm talking to a bunch of people who get up and speak in public, it's like, folks, be really careful what you say, because people may hear you and not understand what you meant. People will hear part of what you said and misquote you, not necessarily, with malice, but they'll remember what it is that they think you said. And just be really careful and really clear. Right? So that might be the message to the graduating class of the Rabbinical School 2025. But if I'm talking to a broader community, I might just say, look, guys, be careful what you say about other people. Be careful what you say that you think is private, because sometimes the walls have ears. And you just never know who's going to overhear what you thought you were saying privately. I remind people when they're in the office, don't have conversations that ought to be private there, because other people are going to hear them. Someone is talking to, well, me, I close my door. So if I think the conversation, or if the conversation starts to go, I just say, excuse me, and I close my door. Right? But if someone's talking to Rady, well, my office door is open most of the time. Robin's office door is open. You have no idea who might be sitting in the conference room or out in the foyer. There may be a lot of ears to whom you are not speaking, but who might still hear you. So it's like, be careful what you say and where you say it, because stuff has a way of. So it's a very different message. And I'm wondering whether the audience determines somewhat how this Mishnah gets taught. Academic for a certain cohort, or for the masses. It's why sometimes I will say, please don't quote me out of context. Why? Because I know that whatever I say after that is out of context going to sound really, really bad or outrageous. But in context it makes perfect sense.
Someone I knew took a paragraph out of an article, and then they took 2 sentences out of that paragraph. And when you took the 2 sentences out, they had nothing to do with anything that the author wrote about.
Yeah, that
And
can.
they were used in a totally skewed way.
Yeah, look, I remember in my senior sermon, I quoted one of my teachers, Rabbi Neil Gilman of blessed memory, and someone didn't like what I said built on his quote. And so, well, Neil was there, so someone went to him and said, "Is that really what you said?" And he said, "Yes, that was a very accurate quote and apt application of the quote. I'm sorry you didn't like it, but don't blame Ellingberg. He quoted me correctly." Right? So I was very happy to hear that story after the fact. But it's one of those where, yes, you can take a quote, and if it's out of context, can mean something very different. In the same way that punctuation makes a difference.
Yeah, that's the whole book.
Right.
Each shoots and leaves.
Each shoots and leaves. You know the book?
I do.
Oh, yeah, I love
I've
that
got
book.
that book.
All right, but long before Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, I studied in Israel with a woman named Nechama Leibowitz, remarkable woman, incredible teacher of Torah. But she said, you know, we trust the punctuation. And she's, if you change the punctuation, you change everything. So she's going like, oh, take the, you know, Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances. And it says, Lo tirtzach, thou shalt not murder. Okay. Or does it say, Lo, no, tirtzach, kill. Right? All of a sudden, it went from a blatant anti-murder statement to, no, go ahead, kill. And it's like, you know, now the whole class is laughing because we all recognize that that is clearly not the intent of that phrase. But, you know, you put a comma, you put a question mark instead of an exclamation mark, and everything is subvertible.
Woman without her man is nothing. Have you heard that? That's a classic.
Okay, so how you read something, how you contextualize it or acontextualize it can transform the way it's understood. And so part of the message to the rabbinical class, if you will, is try not to leave latitude or room for confusion or misinterpretation in what you say. Not always so easy because you can't control how the listener hears what you say. And I know this because sometimes people come up to me and say, oh, Rabbi, I really like when you said, and I'm going like, I don't think I said that. But yeah. And I'm going like, no, I don't think so. I think I said, you sort of realize that, no, the person heard it and it's sort of attached to something they were thinking and reinforced that thought as opposed to my thought, which was different. And, you know, so it's a good, you know, example of this, where even when you try to be clear, you just don't know. Okay. And then the last piece of our Mishnah is the one that kind of feels tacked on. You know?
Oh, yeah, okay.
And do not say, when I have leisure, I will study, lest you never have leisure. I mean, I think it's true. It's always easy to find excuses for not doing something, whether it's Torah study or exercise or there are any, we're good at that sort of stuff.
Things off.
You know, but Torah study requires a commitment. It requires a commitment of time and a commitment of mental focus. Right? And if those aren't there, then it's not going to succeed. Right? So I agree with him. I struggle a little bit to attach it to all the stuff that came before.
The stuff that came before kind of fits because it relates to community. Because if you think you're all arrogant or you're not sure, you withdraw. They kind of go together as being part of a community. And even understanding or not saying things is all part of, you know, good community relations and self-relation. But the last one.
Okay, so given that I think both Hillel and Rabbi Yehuda and Asi were pretty brilliant guys, I'm going to try to offer the following as a thought as to why it really does fit here, even though it feels a little disconnected.
Okay.
All right.
So if you study, you do all that.
Well, in part, how do you know how to act as part of the Jewish community?
Because you studied.
Well, because you
Right.
studied Jewish values and Jewish ethics and Jewish history, and you studied Torah as sort of the ground norm upon which Jewish society and values and ethics are done, and that helps you do all of those other things. It cements you as part of the community because you get the community. Hold that thought for half a second, Bill. You know, one of the things that I have found personally kind of frustrating in so much of the debate that has gone on with regard to Israel in the last, I don't even know how many years, is the remarkable ignorance of history that underlies it. And it exists in all sorts of places. But if you don't have facts and knowledge in hand, you can't have an intelligent conversation. And look, I don't think I'm going to shock anybody when I say that I have been deeply troubled by the decisions and choices made by the current Israeli government. So having said that in public before, I don't think I'm breaking new ground here.
No.
But when there are people who are talking without any sense of, you realize, of course, that whether it was the right of the United Nations to create a partition and divide the country into two parts, that was done, and one party to that agreed to the partition and the other rejected it. And rejected it repeatedly over the course of decades. And with each rejection, in fact, you could argue, made the situation of the people that they were purporting to support worse. Everybody, I read a lot of sci-fi stuff, so alternate realities come easy to me, right? But imagine a universe in which, in 1947, when the UN votes to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and into an Arab state and internationalize Jerusalem, right? Was Ben-Gurion happy? Were the representatives of the provisional government of Israel happy? No, they hated this deal. But they said yes because half a loaf was better than nothing, right? And now in our alternate reality, imagine if Jordan and the other Arab countries, instead of saying, oh, no, we're just going to attack Israel, get rid of all the Jews, and poof, problem solved. Imagine if they said, yes, we don't have Israel's War of Independence in 1948 because it's not necessary in the alternate reality. We don't have the Sinai Campaign of 56. We don't have 1967 Six-Day War. We don't have the Fedayeen and the PLO and all of the even more radical groups. We don't have Hamas. We don't have Hezbollah. We don't have any of that because there was no purpose to their existence, because everybody said, you know what? Half a loaf is better than none. And what would the West Bank and Gaza have looked like in that alternate reality? The answer is I have no clue. Because I know that Israel would look like Israel looks because the same people that that built it up, and it would have been maybe even better and easier because they weren't spending as much money on defense as they did. I have no idea what that other state would have looked like, other than it had to look better than the reality that existed over the decades and currently exists. Right? This is my alternate universe thing. By the way, things always work better in alternate universes. It's one of those quirky facts of life. So, but you need to know the history. You need to know that when the Jewish National Fund was created and Baron de Hirsch and Rothschild were sending money and Jews were going to Arabs and saying, hey, can I buy your land? And they would go like, you want to buy this piece of junk? You want to pay me how much for it? Bismuth sugar? Yeah, sure, no problem. I mean, from that perspective, they're going like, it's dirt. It's sand. It's useless. It's worthless. You want it? And you want to pay me for it? Thank you, Habibi. You're my best friend. You want to give me a lot of money for something that's worth nothing? I'll take it from you, idiot. Moron. You want to? I'm happy to. You're cheating yourself, but this one day, because the people that were selling it could never have envisioned what was going to become of it. So, you know, those are pieces of history that are important to know when you're having this conversation in the present. And not enough people know about it. And if they really cared, they would educate themselves a little bit more about the last 150 years. Okay, Bill, thank you. You've been very patient.
Rabbi, going back to the earlier discussion of leisure and study that we had, I was just going to comment, what about teaching your children? Is that part of the leisure time when you're supposed to be studying, or does that come under your work component? How do you teach?
Oh, I would look, teaching is always a form of study also. If you think about it, you know, there's a great statement somewhere in the Gemara, I don't remember where, wherein I think it's, the sage Shmuel says, Mikol Talmidai Hiskalti, that I have learned something from all of my students. And sometimes it's because they ask questions to which I have to articulate an answer, which maybe was inchoate within me and I was comfy with it, or I was just so accustomed to it that I never really gave it much thought. Right? So teaching and study are sort of the two sides of the same coin. You know?
Thank you.
Look, you want to think about this. We'll come back to the Seder for a second. What's the goal of the Seder on one level? Do stuff that triggers questions, that triggers discussion. Right? It's why I have fewer, some of my colleagues have objections to all of the newfangled stuff that keeps getting added to the Seder plate. And I get it, because at a certain point it gets to be a little too much. Because I saw a cartoon before Pesach this year with which I think had 7 new things that have come onto the Seder plate, which is mind-boggling when you think that there were only 6 originals. You know, and all of a sudden we've added so many other things. Right? And so you add them all and it just becomes too lost. But doing something outrageous, especially if you're having a lot of the same people year after year, is a great way to make people think about something. You know, if you were at my Seder table or I was at yours and you put a bowling ball on the table I might notice that. And I might say to you, Bill, why the heck do you have a bowling ball on your Seder table? And you might say something to me like, oh, just roll with it, Rabbi. Sorry. I have no idea why you have a bowling ball. It was the most outrageous thing I could think of. But it would trigger a question, and it might have some, purpose in mind. In the same way that teachers will sometimes in the classroom do something just to grab people's attention. So there you go. Okay, Chevra. That's it for Mishnah 5. Next week, Mishnah 6.
Which
Sorry,
one's that one?
the next one.
The next one.
No, not next week.
Literally go in order.
We literally go in order.
Ever done
No,
this?
wait, it's not. Rabbi,
What about Shavuot?
Oh, next week is Shavuos. Thank you.
But we don't have class.
We don't have class next week because we can't do this. So we will, 2 weeks, we will do Mishnah 6.
The other thing I was going to say, Rabbi, is that a lot of times when you are in the place of teaching, you yourself are learning more because you're preparing for them. You're trying to think of different ways to explain things, and
Ain't that the truth?
yes, and it settles in your mind even more. So, just wanted to
Oh,
add that.
absolutely, absolutely. Like when I in prepare, this will come as not a shock. I've studied Pirkei Avot before,
No.
right? But every time I have to teach Pirkei Avot, I use a commentary that I haven't used before because I want to get that other perspective, that other insight that makes it fresh, new, edifying for me. And something you said is equally true, Celia, which is the me who's reading this Mishnah now is not the same me who read this Mishnah before I had children or when I was in rabbinical school or. All of our experiences change us and affect how we read and react to something.
There's an Asian story about them viewing the moon, and when you're young, it's just up there, an orb in the sky. And as
No, it's a wheel of cheese.
Yeah. Thank you, Belle. And when you're old and it's down there on the patio with you, and you can see every crevice and the lines and all. Because you have all this knowledge and past experience and stuff, so you see things. I find that when I reread some things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's why we, are on this constant loop of reading Torah, because the words of Torah don't change, but we change, our circumstances change, and the thoughts that are triggered by what we read are about what's roiling in our minds and in our souls in the present.
Very timely, right before Shavuot.
Yeah.
I've heard rumors about this Shavuot.
Thank you, Rabbi. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure, as always. The next congregational dinner is mid-June.
Mid-June.
Superman days.
But how do I decorate for Superman? Comic book store's not going to give me their stuff because they can sell it.
Okay, so you can do what you just did, which is ask the rabbi, and the rabbi will see what he has tucked away in his treasure trove of stuff.
Yeah, because my son's stuff is anime and it's all boarded and boxed, and he's
And-
wrestling with whether he needs to get rid of Neil Gaiman's stuff now because he's not a nice person.
Oh, I don't know much about Neil Gaiman. I know he's written and created a ton of stuff, and
Well, now he
some of
did
which I've.
something.
But do me a favor, just send me a text or an email to remind me to peruse, because I'm sure I have things that I can,
Cause I don't have anything.
and I know I do.
I'm teddy bears.
Rabbi, can I ask one other question? You
Sure.
brought up that we're going to be having in after Sukkot and such, that there will be a new weekday Siddur.
Yes.
Will we be able as individuals to purchase at the same time so we can get like a better group
Okay.
rate?
Okay, so
Check
Rhoda,
your
read your email, check your
Okay.
email. A message went out from Steve Meyerson as ritual chair earlier today.
Okay,
Or-
I haven't had a chance today.
Or if it has, I think it went out already. If it hasn't,
Okay,
it
but
will.
this morning.
It did go out. Okay, and basically what we're asking is that anybody who wishes to procure their own copy needs to contact the office by June the 9th.
Okay,
And that way we'll know how many people want to piggyback on the order that the congregation is making.
It's $33 plus mailing and shipping, but they don't know what mailing and shipping is yet.
Right. Until we know
Okay.
how many copies we're getting, we won't know the shipping costs. But $33 for the pre-order price, which is the regular price is $55.
that's what I was, because with all our other Siddurim that we've added, we've done the same thing, so, except for
no.
one.
Okay, so check your email, but yes,
Thank you.
the answer is absolutely. Anybody who wishes to obtain their own copy will have an opportunity to do so. I have to admit, I was very excited to see the email, because after my last conversation with the chair of the publications committee, I was really not anticipating that this was going to actually happen, given the number of conservative congregations who no longer have a daily minyan of any kind.
Oh, that's true.
I really, and I have to admit that he was a little, I don't want to say dejected, but he was not encouraged. Because the ultimate issue was financial. Because he said, in terms of text, it was set, it was ready, it just needed the financing to be put in place.
Mhm.
So without knowing specifically, I'm going to guess that someone with a deep pocket stepped forward and said, okay, let's get this going.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, welcome. All right, so
Chag Sameach in
having been
advance.
reminded that next week, next Tuesday is the second day of Shavuot, we will reconvene for our mission, Pirkei Avot study in 2 weeks.
Louis and
Thank
Bobby
you.
be here then.
That would be nice.
Yeah, they went out to pick up some stuff this morning, but they said they're not well yet.
Yeah, it bounced back slow.
Luach.
This is close to 90, so it's.
Yeah,
takes
there
a
you
while.
see, it takes a while.
I'm heading to California next week, so I
Very
might,
nice.
might spend some time with my son.
Oh, that's exciting.
I'm not sure the date yet, but
Okay,
I'm gonna
good,
try to
good.
be here for Monday and Tuesday's services, but I'm thinking of Wednesday. But,
Where in California?
right outside of San Francisco, San Carlos.
My son spent a year in LA, and I've got second cousins out in California.
Yes.
Every once in a while, I feel guilty if I spend so much more time with my daughter's family. And so, and then I go and I visit for a couple of days and I remember why.
Has he been out there a long time?
Yeah. He's lived all over. He's an accountant,
Hmm.
but he's pretty good at what he does, and he also fluent in a couple of languages, so he's been going all over the place.
Wow.
And now he's been in California for quite a while. I think that's probably where they'll stay. But I love visiting him.
Mhm.
It just at some point I'm thinking, how many more hours? It's good.
Yeah, that's what you're saying.
Yeah. I had a question for you. It's an
Please.
opinion. And and if you don't want to, it's just driving me crazy. I want to ask your opinion about Harvard. It's and
Okay.
if you don't have time or you don't want to talk about it,
Can you
yes.
narrow the question a little bit?
So the concern that I have is, I'm going to say people's misunderstanding of teaching anti-Semitism. What does that mean? Does that mean you're anti-Semitic and you're teaching people how to be anti-Semitic, or you're teaching about it, etc.? Is that indeed or what we are seeing happening? And again, I know it gets political, and I'm trying real hard not to go in that avenue. Is this, there are a lot of Jewish professors at Harvard, a lot of Jewish students. I know it's very open internationally. Is this, should we be more concerned than I see people being concerned about what's happening, the funding being taken away? And is it just
Okay.
because someone's son didn't get in, this is vindictive? I mean, I'm, there are a lot of different ways, and I really don't even know where to research or where to talk because the opinions are so different.
No, I will answer as best I can. Right? I will say that Harvard, like most universities in this country, failed its Jewish student population.
Yes.
I think there's no way around that. And that whether it was an Ivy or a non-Ivy, the schools that handled it well are the schools that didn't have to handle it at all. It's like CNU had some small protests, 20 students. And it never rose to anything, and therefore and the students didn't do anything other than use their First Amendment right to say this is what we think. Okay. It was really kind of a non-issue, and it was easy for CNU because it was a non-issue because it never rose to anything. But
University of Arizona actually was as successful, and they're enormous.
okay,
Their president stepped in and stopped it immediately, and it didn't happen. The way
okay,
it did everywhere else.
And
But it's not
I'm
just small.
yeah, and I'm
it
sure
is
that there are.
possible, yeah.
I'm sure that, and the fact that CNU has a minuscule Jewish population probably
It was actually
yeah
easier to do it.
easier to do it.
But they did it at University of Arizona, and that's a very large.
That is a very large institution with a very significant Jewish population. But by and large, I think the universities failed their Jewish students and allowed behaviors to go on and things to be said at, to, and about Jewish students that were they said about any other group would have been stopped in a nanosecond. I remember, the pendulum swings in some ways, but we lived through a period where, everybody was, taking umbrage at microaggressions. If you said something that was even remotely possibly understood by someone as being hurtful, it's like, oh, you're in trouble. You can't say that, right? And sometimes these things were so marginal that I'm going like, basically you're advocating for muteness. And yes, sometimes people are going to say certain things that are offensive to you. Guess what? That's a reality, and you have to sort of grow up a little bit and learn how to create your barriers. When, and I'm going to take it out of the university context, but it could just as easily have happened on a university context, right? When neo-Nazis are allowed to march in Skokie, Illinois, as an expression of First Amendment in a community that is filled with Jews and Holocaust survivors, and their right to do so is defended because that's free speech. It's like, Is it hurtful? Sure. Why did they choose Skokie? Because it was going to be hurtful, right? But the decision to allow them to do it was the only possible decision because First Amendment allows for people to say stuff that pisses me off.
Yeah.
Right? They, as long as they didn't say, oh, look, there's a bunch of Jews over there, let us go hurt them. I'm not going to say it's fine, but it's necessarily tolerable. If you had that group on campus, all right, you have the Adolf Hitler fan club, who are part of the student body of the University of Sheboygan, and they want to have something on campus. Guess what? On one level, they're allowed to. On another level, however, they might actually be in violation not of university rules about hate speech, wherein, yes, as a First Amendment right, you may have the right to say that in public. However, we as a private institution are going to limit the scope of speech, because we can, in order to create a safer bubble for everybody. And I have no doubt that that would have made a case that would have gone to the Supreme Court. But on one level, that's what universities were doing when they legislated against all these microaggressions. So because of their willingness to limit speech when it affected this group, that group, the fact that they did nothing is abject failure. That said, this whole, everything that's happening with Harvard now really has nothing to do with anti-Semitism anymore. It really, truly no longer has anything to do with it.
But the defense of what's going on is that.
And by the way, I think that's going to hurt the Jewish community in the long run, because what's it doing? All right, all the people who are being hurt by what's happening, who are they going to blame? They're going to blame us. So by saying I'm doing this to protect you, no, at a certain point, no, you're not. Because not all of these people who are doing research in the medical sciences and other sciences are not brewing up, oh, let us concoct in our lab the perfect anti-Semitic drug that will make everybody no, that's not what they're doing, right? Not every single student who comes from wherever they're coming from bring with them anti-Semitic attitudes, right? Now, I don't know a ton about China, right? Other than there's never been a very large Jewish community in China. All right. I have, I know someone who used to say, yeah, I was made in China, because his parents moved eastward across Russia and ended up in Shanghai during World War II. And he says, yeah, I was made in China. It's like, okay, that's very cute. Right. But so does China have an indigenous hatred of Jews? No, because there ain't no Jews there for them to have any feelings about whatsoever. So am I worried that some student from China is coming to America to spread anti-Semitism? Yeah, no, I'm really not. And to say all those students are not allowed because of this is
ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. It's overkill. It's like, you want to say we need to do better at protecting students? Yes, because as I said, when I started, they failed the Jewish student population, because no other population on campus would have been allowed to be attacked that way. if someone had gone up to someone in the LGBTQ plus community and said to them something as hateful as some of what was said to Jews on campus, they would have been expelled. Or punished in some way, shape, or form.
Has Harvard been anti-Semitic historically? Because look at the
Look,
money
the
in all families.
The reality, yes, but there's a lot of Jewish money
Yes.
and Jewish old families.
But you still.
But every high institution of higher learning has some history of anti-Semitism and a history of closing its doors to Jews.
Yeah.
Right? And then they stopped. And it's like, and everybody can tell stories about, oh, I was, I was the first Jew who went to Columbia College, right? I think Isaac Asimov was sort of like one of the first Jews that went to Columbia College.
Yeah.
Brilliant guy, right? But he had to deal with that firstness,
Yeah.
right? So yes, was there? And I'm sure there were people that made his life miserable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But I can tell you, I went to Columbia and I didn't experience that. Was there a lot of stuff going on campus? Sure, there was always stuff going on in campus. And you put that kind of a diverse population together, there are going to be rubs. And it's a question of, well, how do I deal with that? Do I lash out? Well, that's not a very mature response. Do I engage in conversation? Maybe, if I think it's going to be in some way productive. Do I go to the administration and say, hey, we've got a problem? Possibly. Do I just walk away and say, maybe sometimes, because that's kind of how you deal with it. So, but it was not this, and part of what is, especially at Columbia, it's like, you have allowed students to destroy property and take over buildings, and in so many ways act in illegal fashion, both in terms of New York City law and campus rules, and you did not punish them. Well, you know what? That's wrong. That's where the problem in this whole thing is, and and I don't care if it's Columbia or Harvard or Penn or and it's and when you find the places like Arizona that did it,
Unbelievable that they did have the problem there. That's what shocked me.
but they didn't, because the administration said,
No.
we will not allow this on our campus, because guess what? You can't smash windows on our campus and get away with it. And you can't do these kinds of things. I don't care who your target is, because that violates our code of conduct and our standards of behavior, and it's just not an option. Just not an option. So my fear is this has gone,
But it's
this is all
a
about,
life of its own, and I understand when it originally started, and I understand the concern of anti-Semitism on campuses, but I'm seeing that being used. And as I said, I'm talking about some people who I have respected in the Jewish community who are using that, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's not what this is about.
well,
It's about, we stood up.
Well-
So we didn't do something.
Well,
It went into
No,
a
I
personal.
think it's more than that, and that, and again, it's hard to separate the conversation from politics.
right.
I think there's a real reason why that school and certain others are being targeted by certain people, and has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. But it's being used as an excuse, which I do find is quite dangerous.
It is dangerous. Look,
It makes us look terrible.
it does not, it really does make us look
I'm getting
bad.
serious.
And it makes us it really makes us targets. Because all of these people who feel like they are being harmed because the Jews are being protected, well, guess what? They ain't gonna be our friends tomorrow or the day after.
But as I said, that's the problem I'm having in that struggle is it's very, we all know how difficult it is to reason with unreasonable people. And I think in that this particular argument, I don't see them going after the University of Pennsylvania. I don't see them going after Georgetown University. And if you look at it, their populations are very similar and the fights, because those particular institutions have meaning to the people who are attacking places like Harvard and, you know, some of the others. And it just scares me because I don't know how to fight it anymore. So,
Well, and part of it is, look, Harvard is like this easy icon. Columbia is an easy icon, right? And Harvard sits in what city?
Boston.
And which is part of Massachusetts, which is kind of blue. Okay, New York City,
Yes,
very blue. Gee, what a surprise. You're not going off after UPenn. Yes, Philadelphia's a blue state, blue city, but
That's the best.
but the Pennsylvania as a state is really kind of purple. And you know, it can cut both ways. And so maybe and I hate to say it, UPenn doesn't have the same name recognition that a Harvard or a Columbia has. And we can tattoo it with, left wing, all that negative jargon that we like to throw out at people.
Stereotypes.
So I really worry because anytime you start to anytime you start to really whittle away at First Amendment rights,
well,
it's really scary because there's a whole lot more of them than there are of us, and I don't want to be beholden to them to protect us, because when push comes to shove, if it's not in their interest, they won't.
it's like forever.
If you don't mind, I'm just
Yes.
gonna flip to the other
Okay.
side of the table so I can start to put stuff away.
When you look at a lot of the universities, all of them, when you're a member of a minority, you got special, they allowed a certain number more of the minorities in a class. The only minority that never, ever got any extras with the Jews.
Yeah,
I mean, you look back, there's never.
yes.
And you look at it, and we are a minority by far.
But we also
Right, but
get a
we-
lot of positions, and that was something like, there's too many of us and we run everything.
Well, but it's the mythology of the Jewish community. And part of the mythology is based on truth. The Jewish community, as a group, has been, I'll say, disproportionately successful.
Yeah.
That's
It was part of our ethical thing,
all right.
immigrants came over, and our thing was to make our children, give our children educations. And we should be in better position than our parents were.
Yeah, but I think that-
immigrants.
I think that was true for most
Most
immigrants. All right, just that for
But
whatever
education was-
reason, we kind of,
Very successful.
right.
We don't hear about those that are not.
Asian
Right,
very
nobody,
successful.
I would guess that most people are completely oblivious to the fact that 20% minus of the Jewish community lives below the poverty line.
People were
Because
raised
we
with-
are affluent, we are successful, we are thriving, and therefore that's a statistic that nobody knows because it doesn't fit with the mythology.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring this up. I know you
No,
have
no,
other things to do, but that,
No, I notice
Yeah.
I'm doing my
yeah,
things.
I have to stay away from that. back in the day, my research and anything that I've ever written has been things like teaching the Holocaust, of analyzing how one teaches the Holocaust in US history classes in North Carolina, for example. And so when, once you've kind of gone back and you've looked at how it's presented and how it comes about and what caused it, and, you get into all of that,